Welcome to the Adoption and Foster Care Journey, a podcast to encourage, educate, and equip you to care for children and youth through adoption, foster, and kinship care. Hosted by an adoptive mom with over 22 years of kinship and adoptive parenting experience. She's on this journey with you. Please welcome Sandra Flach.
But he knows the way that I take. When he has tried me, I shall come out as gold. That is Job, chapter 23, verse 10. I am Sandra Flach, your host. Welcome to the Adoption and Foster Care Journey podcast. I am so grateful that you tuned in today for some encouragement and community for your parenting journey. Parenting kids with trauma is hard. And if they were prenatally exposed to alcohol or other drugs, that's like next level hard, right? Talk about being tried in the fire, right? It can feel like no one understands. It can feel like all we do is fight for our kids, for accommodations and supports and services and resources, and nobody gets it, right? Unless you are parenting a kiddo with trauma or prenatal exposure and FASD, it can feel so lonely and isolating and hard, right? But you are not alone, because we here at this podcast have resources for you. I am on this journey with you as a parent of 5 adopted kids, 2 of them with an FASD. They were both diagnosed with fetal alcohol syndrome. And they're now, goodness, one is going to be 21 this summer, and one will be 19 in the fall. I had to stop and think about that because I'm like shocked. So now it's approaching young adulthood, and it gets even more interesting and even more challenging. But like I said, we have resources for you here, including this one. Check this out.
Sandra Flach, host of the Adoption and Foster Care Journey podcast, and FASD educator Debbie Raymond, invite you to join Hope for the FASD Journey, a virtual support community for parents and caregivers raising individuals with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, diagnosed or not. This faith-based support community meets online 3 times each month, features special VIP guests, and a private Facebook group for members only, which includes Soul Care Saturday video devotionals led by Sandra and Deb. Both Sandra and Deb are adoptive moms raising kids with FASD and facilitators of the Facets neurobehavioral model. For details and to register, visit justicefororphansny.org/hope-community. That's justicefororphansny.org/hope-community.
So if you did not know, FASD is the leading cause of developmental and learning disabilities worldwide. 1 in 20 school-age kids in the United States have been prenatally exposed to alcohol. Most are not diagnosed, or they're not diagnosed accurately. That 1 in 20 rate is higher than autism. And it's like, I think autism is 1 in 36 kids are diagnosed with autism, but almost all of us have heard about autism, right? But not so many people know about FASD. And it's so prevalent among the population of kids in child welfare, kids who've been adopted, kids who are in foster care, kids who are in kinship placements as well. So like I said before, as a mom of 2 kids, young adult kids with fetal alcohol syndrome, I know how difficult and how isolating this journey can be. And we have these resources here for you. Resources I wish I had many, many, many years ago when we started this journey. Our boys got diagnosed when they were 6 and 8, but aside from a pamphlet on ADHD, we were giving nothing else to understand this or to learn. And when you did the internet search back in the day, it was dark and hopeless outcomes for our kids. And that is not necessarily the case, right? It doesn't have to be. So not only is this podcast designed as a resource for all adoptive, foster, and kinship caregivers, whether or not you're raising kids with an FASD, it is an especially vital resource for those of us who are parenting kids who are prenatally exposed. In addition to the podcast, I also offer online and in-person training on FASD. And coming up right around the corner here, Wednesday, July 24th, let me look at the calendar. At 10 a.m. Eastern, I am offering a 3-hour FASD workshop exploring FASD, the causes and the symptoms and how to support our kids and how to apply accommodations using the Facets neurobehavioral model. I am a certified facilitator of the Facets model. It's a brain-based approach to parenting and caring for kids prenatally exposed, kids with FASD or even other neurobehavioral disorders. So that workshop is coming up July 24th. And if you want to go really deep, if you know this is what we're living with, this is what I'm dealing with, and I need some help and some support and some training in this, coming up in October, I am starting a deep dive into FASD, also using the Facets neurobehavioral model. This is a 6-session, 3 hours each session workshop. Once a week for 6 weeks. It's a total of 18 hours worth of content. And that is coming up in starting in October. So to register for any of the FASD workshops, I also offer coaching for parents and the support group that you heard about in the beginning. To register for all of the above, you would go to our website, justicefororphansny.org, and click on the training tab at the top of the page, and you'll see the FASD drop down. If you want to go right to where you can register for one of the online courses, there's also a button that says registration. That'll get you to the registration for the workshops as well. But it's all there on our website, and there's a link in the show notes. So make sure you do that. Also, I don't often talk about this, but I have my own website, sandraflach.com, where I have other resources, especially for about FASD, and I blog. And I've done a whole series of blog posts on the primary symptoms of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. I take one blog post, one symptom per blog post, and kind of unpack it and go deeper with that. So I hope that you will check that out. That's at sandraflach.com. And of course, to get the preliminaries out of the way, subscribe to this podcast, follow it, download it, leave a review if you listen on Apple. We also are on YouTube. So if you like to watch your podcast, you can find this our podcast episodes. Each one of the recordings are on YouTube at the Justice for Orphans channel. So you have to go to at Justice for Orphans there as well. So please do all of those things, because that really helps us, show up in a little bit higher in the searches when other parents are searching for podcasts about adoption, about foster care, about FASD, and we want to make sure that they can find us. So you can help with that. So today we have a guest I'm super excited to finally have on the show. Barb Clark is the director of training at Families Rising, formerly known as NACAC. And she's also a parent of 5 adult children. She is passionate about learning from her many mistakes and sharing them with others so that they can avoid the same mistakes. She uses humor and real life experiences to help professionals and caregivers challenge the use of traditional strategies and push them to think outside the box. Boy, I've been there. She graduated from the University of Minnesota in youth development, but has learned more from her kids than she ever did in college. She is committed to improving the education and lives of individuals who are prenatally exposed to drugs and alcohol through her work at Families Rising and as a lead coach in the FASD Caregiver Kickstart, and as a private consultant as well. So please welcome to the show, Barb Clark. Hey, Barb.
Hi, Sandra.
I'm so excited to have you on the show. I know recently you were you were one of our VIP guests in the support group that we lead. And I've been following you on social media and seeing you in some other FASD groups online. So I'm so excited to get to finally have a chat with you and have our listeners get to know you. So thanks so much for being on.
Absolutely. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah. So I can't wait to hear more of your story because I know you are a parent of 5 adopted kiddos, or they're not, I don't even know if they're all adopted, but you have 5 adult kids. So tell us about that. Are they all adopted? Some of them? Tell us about that.
Yeah. So our first 4 that we have were infant adoptions. We got those 4 kids between the ages of 5 and 10 weeks of age here in the United States. And then our 5th one is we call him a fictive kin. He's our fictive kin kind of placement. So he's not legally adopted, but we claim him as our son and he claims us as parents. He is actually dating my oldest daughter. So that's obviously why we can't adopt him. But he, for all intents and purposes, he is our child also.
Wow. So you did. So they're all 5 basically adopted. And so what led you initially on that journey to become an adoptive parent?
Yeah, before my husband and I got married, we knew that adoption would be a part of our journey. It was just something that we were both passionate about. We had some adoption in our family, have adopted nephews and nieces. And so we kind of thought our plan, we thought the plan would be we would have biological children and adoptive children, but that was not the plan. The biological stuff didn't work out. So no, but that was totally fine with us. And we just pivoted towards adoption then.
Awesome. So, and babies, they all came, at least the first 4 came as babies. And I know I've heard some folks say, well, if we adopt them as babies, we won't have all of that trauma and all of those problems. That's not true, as you and I both know.
Yes.
So tell us about your early parenting journey. What were the different challenges? Just kind of unpack those early days for us.
Yeah, no, I would say, my husband and I went into our parenting journey with with way too much arrogance. Like we had been around children a ton. I worked with at-risk teenagers. My favorite ones were the really challenging ones that would, cuss at you and tell you to F off. Those were the kids I was really good with. And teenagers in particular was my specialty. And my husband, although he's an accountant, is also really good with kids. And we had watched nephews and nieces for weeks on end and tons of experience with kids. And we're like, I don't know why everybody thinks this parenting thing is so hard, right? They're just great. And you just love them, be consistent, be strict, all that business. And then, after we started our parenting journey and, even with our children in infancy and those toddler years, a lot of the typical kind of parenting things just weren't working, and just like sleep was an issue. Several of our kids had disrupted sleep patterns even as infants and have pretty much their entire life. But, at that point, we knew really nothing about that and how that was potentially related to in utero trauma and early life trauma of the separation from their first families and all of that kind of stuff. So basically, what was interesting was that our oldest daughter, and any stories that I ever talk about publicly about my children, I have permission from all of them to share. But our oldest daughter, her name is Akila. She'll be 25 in a few weeks. And she was always kind of our challenging one, even as a toddler, when she started walking and talking, I'm like, wow, something's off here. And our pediatrician that we had at the time told me I was a little paranoid and, told me to get the Spirited Child book and things like that, which was completely not helpful at all with her. And so, yeah, we just had this interesting journey. But what happened with us was when we adopted our fourth one, so our kids are all kind of like a year apart. Right now they are 21, 22, 23, 24, and 24. And so when we adopted our fourth, our youngest, whose name is Zeke, he was, Akila was, the kids were 3, 2, 1, and then a newborn. And Zeke was born prematurely. And he was, he was born, we lived in the state of Minnesota. He was born in Florida, which is where we actually live now. But we didn't really know what we were getting into. We were just told he was in the NICU and needed to be discharged, and he was 4 or 5 weeks of age. So he came home on oxygen and apnea monitor, had underdeveloped lungs and some different, a lot of medications and things like that. Ended up being hospitalized multiple times the first several months of his life, and almost passed away several times. It was a very scary first couple of months. And through that, we ended up getting involved in the Children's Hospital and Clinics of Minnesota system in Minnesota. And prior to that, we had been at another local hospital. Like our son Hezekiah, who's 1 year older than Zeke, had also had some kind of asthma and breathing stuff and had been hospitalized even just a few months before we got Zeke at a different hospital. Really happy with the care, but Zeke was so complicated. We went to Children's and basically never left once we got there. And so while we were there, actually, after we kind of got him through the woods in his first 6 months, he qualified for intensive early child special education intervention services, ECSE, and right at 6 months of age. So we had a special ed teacher, an occupational therapist, and a physical therapist in our house 3 different days a week for an hour, working intensely with him. And so he had those supports for about 4 years. And basically by the time then he was starting kindergarten, he graduated out of special ed and had developmentally caught up to all of his peers with all of that early intervention. But when we ended up going, when we switched our pediatric care to this children's hospital, to their general peds clinic, the first time that our brand new pediatrician met Akila, she immediately picked up on red flags before we even were talking. She said, "Is she pigeon-toed?" And I said, "No, but she's a toe walker." And she was 3.5 at the age. And this pediatrician wrote a little note in the chart, and Akila also had the microcephaly, the small head circumference, and some different things like that. And she, by the end of the appointment, she said, "Well, I really think we should do a neurology consult." And I was like, "Well, tell me why." And again, our old pediatrician, I had tried to bring up issues and was just kind of poo-pooed on it.
Right.
And so this new one, she said, "Well, the toe walking, if they haven't outgrown it by this age, is usually a sign of some different neurological stuff going on. But also with the small head size and the high muscle tone, which also, my children are all African American, so higher muscle tone is common." But she said, just all of these things together, we just should dig into it. So anyways, Akila was after that diagnosed with something called Turner syndrome, which is a chromosomal abnormality that the neurologist was able to catch. And so we thought that was the answer to our differences and the things that were going on, because girls to girls, Turner syndrome is where they're missing the second X chromosome. And girls with Turner syndrome are usually shorter in stature, have some different ADHD, math challenges, and different heart things like that, all these different things. So we thought that was the answer. But then, you fast forward a couple of years later and nothing, all of the typical behavioral strategies and consequences and punishments and things like that are not working. So when she was 6 is when we finally figured out that that she had a fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. And it was really through our own, it wasn't any professional that directed us in that way. It was, she was stealing all the time. And this was causing huge stress and distress between my husband and I and our relationship with her as we're trying to get her to stop stealing. So to try to get her to stop stealing, we ended up throwing away her blankie that she was addicted to as a consequence to teach her to not steal. And we had tried, we were on our 3rd therapist. We had tried all the different positive behavioral interventions, social stories, other consequences. So we kind of went heavy with, if you steal again, we're throwing away this blanket, and which she was completely obsessed with. Didn't work. So that is what led me to start digging farther into what was going on. And we had confirmation of exposure. We just did not understand fetal alcohol.
Yeah. Wow. I think a lot of our listeners are probably shaking their head and nodding like I am, because it sounds like a very familiar story.
Mhm.
A lot of times our regular pediatricians don't get it.
Yes.
They poo-poo it, like you say. We hear
Mhm.
that a lot.
Mhm.
I have to think that maybe being in Minnesota was helpful, because I hear that they're kind of leaps and bounds ahead of other states when it comes to FASD.
Mhm.
Which I thought you were going there really with your hospital story.
Yeah,
Uh,
no.
yeah,
Well, it's interesting because Minnesota is definitely, I think it's the most FASD competent state in
yeah.
the country. But still, it was, and again, this was 19 years ago, or well, I'm not good
Mhm.
at math, but she's almost 25 and she was 6 when we figured out, say about 19 years ago. And even then at this very prominent children's hospital, eventually, as I started doing training and getting involved in this, I was able to do some different training at Children's Hospital. Started out small, like in just this small clinic within their big system. And then eventually I got to do some grand rounds. But one of the, after the first time I actually trained there, I was on a bunch of committees there. And this one pretty prominent doctor, he and I arrived like next at this monthly meeting a little bit early. It was a lunch meeting. So we were sitting there eating our lunch, and he goes, oh, and he was a total smart aleck kind of guy. And he goes, oh, here's the lady when I walked in who ruined my life. And I was like, oh, what did I do now? And he said, well, after your training that you did last month, I realized that my 24-year-old daughter has an FASD. And I was like,
Wow.
oh, so I don't know that I ruined your life. I think I probably helped to put you in there. And I mean, he was totally joking. And
Yeah.
then we sat and had, when he had met his wife, she had adopted, a girl through foster care. And anyways, and he's like, all of your stuff when you were training, talking about calling the mobile crisis unit, calling the police, talking, all of that stuff was so familiar to me. And I was
Mm.
like, and yet you had no idea that this is what it was. And you're a pediatrician, right?
Yeah.
And I'm like, can you please help me to get into this system to do more training then? And thankfully he was able to help me do that. I've been able to do
Mm.
several trainings at that, at that clinic system. I was able to train, I can't remember how many years ago this was, probably 6 years ago, their entire psychology department, the neuropsychologist,
Wow.
the psychiatrist, the psychologist. And I told this one story towards the end of my training when I'm talking about strategies. I have this Polly Pocket airplane story. And I talk about when we finally started to figure out as parents how we were not effective parents when we were using consequence punitive based measures, and how we needed to switch things, and we were at that complete burnout stage, right? I was at that spot where, oh my gosh, I love these kids dearly, but I hate it when school's out. I hate
Mhm.
summers. I hate weekends. I hate, like, it's, because it just meant more time for raging. And so one day I'm like, okay, we're going to have a good night tonight. I'm going to be a connected relational parent, and I'm going to be organized. I made a schedule. I had a whiteboard. I made it look cute, which is not my thing at all. I hate being crafty, but I was all ready. And Akila's bus came home first, and she comes flying in the door. And just the way that door flew open, I knew I was in trouble, right? I could just tell. And she's like, Mom, we got to go to Target and buy a Polly Pocket airplane. And I was like, what? Oh, but no, look at my beautiful whiteboard schedule here. I'm showing her. And she's like, no, no, Mom, I don't care about that. I don't care about that. And I'm like, but look, we're going to make cookies and you get to choose what kind. And she's like, no, she wouldn't have anything to do with my great idea. And she's like, Mom, it's not a want, it's a need. I need to go to Target and buy a Polly Pocket airplane. I need a Polly Pocket airplane. I'm like, she just thinks just by saying it's a need makes it a need. And
Mhm.
so my internal anxiety, secondary trauma is all kicking in. And I'm trying to distract, right? That's what we try to do, to distract. Like,
Mhm.
what was it made you think of this idea? Were you talking about it on the bus? Or, she wouldn't have any of that. And I'm like, well, that really would be fun to have a Polly Pocket airplane. Polly Pockets are little rubber dolls, right? That are like, I don't know, 2-3 inches, high
Mhm.
and really flexible. And we've got jet skis, we've got limousines with hot tubs, campers. I've got all this stuff, but no airplane. And so I'm like, let's put that on your Christmas list. Christmas is coming up. She's like, no, Mom, I need it now, right? Because it's right now is when and I'm like, oh, well, let's go look it up online, see how much they are, and we can make a chore chart and you could earn it. And she's still stuck on, I need it now. And I'm like, you know what? if you get all the chores done today, when dad gets home from work, we can probably go and get one even. And she didn't like that either because it needed to be this very moment, right? And
Mhm.
so again, my anxiety is just flaring. And so then I'm like, what am I going to do? What am I going to say? Trying to think connected, relational, all that stuff. So I'm like, oh, I have an idea, honey. I said, I have a question. Where does Polly want to go? And she's like, what? And I'm like, well, if she needs an airplane, she must be planning a trip or a vacation. Where is she going to go? And she goes, she thought about it and she goes, Hawaii. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I've always wanted to go to Hawaii. Let's go fill up the bathtub and bring Polly and the jet skis, and you can get your swimsuit on. I'll come up there with you and we're going to go to Hawaii on jet skis. People do it all the time. It'll be super fun, right? And she's like, Mom, she's never flown on a plane and she wants to take her first flight. So,
Aw.
so that didn't work, right? I'm like, oh, nuts. So then I'm like thinking, and I'm running through my house. I'm going to my boys' bedroom, down to our family room, trying to find an airplane because Polly is so little that any airplane for any toy set should work, right? I don't have one airplane in my entire house that I can find. I've got Polly sitting in every kind of boat in the world and trying to get her excited about that, but she wouldn't go with it. So then I'm like, I was literally praying, I'm like, because I just didn't want to be in Rageville all night, which is where we lived just about every night and, weekend. And so I had one last idea I came up with, and I said, I have an idea, honey. How about we make an airplane out of Legos together? I will sit here with you. This will be fun. We're going to make her own customized jet. And she didn't like that idea either. And we ended up raging all night long. So I tell that story when I train, and I shared that with those doctors, right? And I stopped and I said, what did I do wrong? What did I miss? What else should I have said or done? And their mouths were open. And this one doctor raises his hand and he goes, you thought of way more than I ever could have thought of. That was great. And they started clapping. And I'm like, no, but here's the thing why you guys need to understand this. What you need to say to these caregivers when they come back to the next session is, oh my gosh, great effort, way to go, put that in your toolbox, because that's going to work many days. It's not going to work every time. With the way our kids' brains are impacted, it's not, you could be the most connected relational parent doing all the things that we're telling you, and it's not going to work 100% of the time, but way to go, good job. And I told them, I said, because what you often do is you end up making us feel like we did it wrong or we're the problem. And we end up leaving these sessions feeling beat down and deflated, right? And so one of my coworkers a couple of years ago said, I don't think you should tell the Polly Pocket story because it didn't work. And I'm like, no, that's why I need to, because we need to help families to understand that sometimes you could do every single thing we are talking about and still end up with some rough outcomes or a hard day or a hard night or whatever it is. And it doesn't mean that you did it wrong that day. It just means their brain wasn't getting it that day.
Yeah, I totally get that. I'm sure, again, our listeners are all nodding. And I know you've also talked about, after making all the parenting mistakes, because clearly everything you just described, you learned those techniques, right? Those are connected parenting techniques that should work.
Yes.
And before we learn those, we're often in, like where you said you do all the traditional parenting things.
Yes.
And a little bit differently from you, my husband and I had 3 biological children before our adopted kids came. So we thought we knew what we were doing, right? So talk about arrogant. And our first was a kinship placement who came in, and the way she came in, we had no training. There was no classes. There was nothing, because she didn't go into foster care. By coming to us, we avoided that.
Right.
But we were giving no training at all. So we just figured, well, we'll just love her and parent her like we parent our other kids, and we're all going to live happily ever after. Didn't work so well. And then eventually we did adopt internationally, and we adopted a sibling group of 4. First 3 of them came. And then when we brought the 4th one home, by then we were also thinking we knew what we were doing, because the first 3 did kind of click in, pretty easily without any major, craziness going on. But the second we met the youngest one at 5, we knew we were like not equipped. So that's when we finally went on, when we realized, well, consequences don't work with any of these other kids, all the traditional stuff, none of that is working. We found out about trust-based relational intervention and all of that. We went that route, and that worked wonderfully until it didn't, because our youngest did get the FAS, the fetal alcohol syndrome diagnosis, when he was 6. And then turns out his next up higher brother, who was 8 at the time, he also got that diagnosis. So the youngest two are diagnosed.
Sure.
But still, there was, like you encountered, there was no training for that. We got a developmental pediatrician, gave us the diagnosis, handed us a piece of paper about ADHD.
Yes.
Have a
Yes.
nice day.
Yep.
And then there was nothing. So, you know, how did you find out, how did you get that training on FASD?
You know, after the diagnosis, you know, you go into that stage of like hyperactive research. A lot of us
Yep.
caregivers will do that, where we start like, we're reading the books. You know, the first couple of books I read was, you know, Trying Differently Rather Than Harder by
Yep.
Diane Melbourne, and Damaged Angels by Bonnie Buxton. You know, this was years ago, obviously. And, but, you know, again, being in Minnesota, it was a huge blessing because Proof Alliance was there at that stage. They were called MOFAS, the Minnesota Oregon Fetal Alcohol Syndrome. And so I reached out to them, and, you know, at that stage, they didn't have any support groups going. And I said, well, how about if I volunteer and lead a support group? Because, you know, I had been a youth worker and done things like that for years. And so started kind of leading a support group with them. I did start to be a volunteer speaker in their speakers bureau as well. And then eventually started working there, at Proof Alliance for a couple of years, doing family support and training. And did that for a couple of years, and then kind of after that branched out on my own. They were doing some different restructuring and stuff like that didn't fit my family schedule and stuff like that. You know, it's because, as most of us know, working traditional jobs and things like that can be pretty hard with the dynamics of our children and stuff like that. So anyways, just ended up doing some consulting and training kind of on my own on the side, and then eventually started working also at Families Rising. We used to be called NACAC, the North American Council on Adoptable Children, but we just changed our name here in the last year. But when I started, and so we work around adoption, foster, and kinship care, doing advocacy, support, and training around the US and Canada. And so as I was doing that, the job I was hired for was to train adoptive, foster, and kinship parents to lead support groups for each other and support networks for each other. And so, of course, I was immediately like, well, we have to have FASD in this training, right? And at first I got some pushback from the former leadership that we used to have on that. I'm like, no, this is really important. And I pushed and pushed, and then I would get like 45 minutes in our 2-day agenda, or, you know, different, you know, things like that. And so I think the second or third year, I scheduled, I got it pushed up to an hour, and I had it scheduled right before lunch, because I'm like, I know these people are going to want more. Right. And so, of course, they did want more. And what was great was our director at the time was also at that training. And so anyways, I said, okay, well, you know what, go grab your lunch in the hallway, bring it in here, and I'll just keep going. I'll keep talking while y'all eat. So by the end of that, then the director, who was able to see the training and also heard me make, I don't know, I probably have done this with you when I was at your group, but I talk about the comparison of fetal alcohol with various forms of dementia, like Alzheimer's or things like that. And I share a story in my training about that brings the connection to Alzheimer's. And our director at the time, her mother was in the end stages of Alzheimer's. And so it really hit her hard. And after that, it was so awesome. She became this huge national advocate for fetal alcohol and started like in these national meetings within child welfare pushing FASD. And we were able to, and then that I was also kind of at this point of we used to not have kind of revenue-based training at Families Rising. We only had grant-funded training. But we really started kind of trying to promote doing training within child welfare on fetal alcohol, and also on the big behaviors and strategies around the big challenging behaviors. And so that has just kind of blown up here in the last 4 or 5 years. So we've got a huge kind of commitment to that within child welfare, because as you and I know, and most of your listeners, the rates of FASD are high in the general population, and within child welfare, they're even way higher.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm thrilled to hear that you're doing that. Let's talk about some of those big behaviors, because what other, I mean, you mentioned raging, and I know that's a
Yes.
huge one that you talk about. You mentioned stealing early on. What are some of the other behaviors as your kids were growing up that you were
Yeah.
dealing with?
Well, the raging and the stealing were a couple of big ones, especially with our oldest. It's so interesting, and many of us have experienced that. If you've got children that were impacted differently, I mean, that's the thing is, one person with FASD and one person with
Yeah.
FASD, we can see a lot of similarities, but there's always a lot of differences too. And so Akila, God bless her, is my most impacted, who just has the really big, blatant behaviors. And so, so the lying, which we know now is confabulation, didn't know that
Mhm.
back in the day, of course. That's a big one. I would just say too, just the huge inconsistency. That's what just throws off so many adults, whether we're the parents, whether we're the teachers, the therapists, the fact of how one moment they are capable of something and 5 minutes, 10 minutes later, they are not.
Mhm.
And that, which
Yeah.
just makes us make the assumptions that they're being willfully disobedient and
Mhm.
defiant and avoidant and all of those kind of negative things. And so, that those were huge. But, one of the consistent ones with, at least two of my kids was just the fact that consequences and traditional parenting strategies just didn't faze them.
Yeah.
And that, and again, that can be really hard in faith-based communities because we look at behaviors in often the wrong light as
Mhm.
sinful and
Yep.
willful and things like that, and don't understand the neurobehavioral aspect behind behaviors.
Yeah.
And so once we can make that kind of shift, it
Mhm.
can make a huge difference in how we're supporting these kiddos.
Yeah. And your Polly Pocket story makes me think of that rigid thinking, they get fixed on something, or
Mhm.
perseveration, which I have to say, in my early days of really starting to learn about FASD, and I found Jeff Noble's podcast,
Mhm.
um, somewhere, one of those episodes he was talking, and they were talking about perseveration. And I was like, wait, it has a name? Like, I live
Yeah.
this every day with both of my boys. And just the fact that it had a name and it was legitimately something related
Yes.
to this, it was like,
Yes.
okay, all right. It just kind of changed my perspective on,
Absolutely.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
So,
no, because what I'm so bad at remembering quotes, but that the definition of insanity is repetition, right? Or something around that.
yep.
Like that my daughter's one of her main perseverations for was fake fingernails and this is like as a toddler, as early elementary. And like it was like we had so many rages over fake fingernails, and I could go buy packages of them at Walgreens or CVS, and it wouldn't, she couldn't keep them on because of her sensory issues, but she would
Mhm.
still perseverate on them. And even as an adolescent and a young adult, perseverates on wanting to spend money on them, but never keeps them on the length of time that would make, so like, and it's like, and so those things that our kids can perseverate on can become triggers for us now. Like I hate
Yeah.
fake fingernails. Like like
Yes.
it's like it totally traumatizes me. We've had so many rages over them.
Wow. Wow. So, what were some of the things that you've learned in this journey of parenting kids with FASD? So, because you've dealt with some of the really big stuff, the rages and whatnot.
Yeah.
If you could like list your top three things that you've learned, or three, um, you know, um, strategies that you would offer parents who are on this parenting journey.
One of the biggest things that I wish I had learned earlier is to, to stop trying to fix them and just accept who
Mm.
they are. We, as caregivers, and this is just a natural thing that we do as loving caregivers and parents, right? Is we want to fix things for our kids. We want to make their lives easy and not hard. And so we want to find what medication is going to make this better,
Mhm.
what therapy is going to fix this, all these different kind of things around that. And so those are, and I'm not anti-medication, I'm not anti-therapy. I just see I see too many of us, and I'm pointing the finger at myself here, right?
Yep.
I know most people are listening, but my finger is pointing at myself. We go overboard. We are like, we're going to try brain spotting, brain mapping, neurobiofeedback. We're going to try this listening therapy. You know, there's a million different things out there. And again, some of them you might see some gains, you might see some things that are going better, but most of them aren't going to fix the underlying organic brain injury that is there, right? And so what happens so often is we are sending a message to our kids of how broken they are. And so when I talk to it, because this is one of the things that I love to do, is I love to talk to adults who are on the fetal alcohol spectrum. And when I say to them, you know, what advice do you have for the parents that I'm working with and stuff? One of the most common things I will hear from them is they wish that their parents had just stopped trying to fix them and accepted them for who they were. And even when I talk to parents who are way farther down the journey and the road than I am, and I ask them the same thing, they will often say the same thing, that they wish they had just focused more on relationship and connection, because always fighting with their kids to go to this therapy or that therapy and all of those things did have an impact sometimes on relationships. So that's one big thing, is, you know, just not to go overboard on things. Again, it's okay to do some therapies and to try some stuff, but just don't obsess about it too much. So
Yeah,
that's a
it's a
big
good
one.
That's a big one. Any more? Can you think of any others?
Yeah. So the other thing too is really just, it's so much about relationship and connection and just letting go of those things. I was just doing a coaching session with a parent yesterday, and they were falling back to that. It's easy to fall back to this. I feel like I'm enabling them. They're never going to be able to clean up their room. They're never going to be able to live on their own because I keep cleaning their room for them and things like that. And I said, I know that it feels like that. Our muscle memory makes us go back to that place. But if they were capable of cleaning their room regularly, they would, you know? And so, you know, we've got to developmentally remember where they're at. We have to remember the executive functioning skills that it takes to be able to do that on a regular basis without support. And so, you know, that's a huge one too, is to stop. Because we just naturally, our brains go there, like, am I enabling them? I feel like I'm just doing everything for them. Am I, you know, am I being, you know, if this isn't helpful? But usually when they can, they will, you know, when they can, they will.
That's so good. That's so good. And I know I get, cause you know, when you teach this stuff all the time, you know, you feel like you know it. And then when it comes to your own kid, you're like, wait a minute, but I knew that. I knew not to do that.
Right.
Yeah. And one of
Right.
mine, who's my son, who's going to be 19, my big thing this year was, oh, he's got to have job skills and life skills. That's what we have to focus on at school. Like, he needs all these skills. And, you know, we had some difficulty in school. And then, you know, stepping back from all that, I'm like, wait a minute. If developmentally he's really like 9,
Yeah,
I'm not really worried about a 9-year-old having job skills and life skills,
exactly.
you know. So I caught myself falling back into that.
Yes.
But he's 18, going to be 19. He needs to have these skills,
Yes.
but not really, not yet. They'll come in time. So even, you
Yeah.
know, even those of us who are farther along on the journey fall back into some of that thinking.
100%. Our brains almost always go back to those places. And so, you know, I also, you know, I'm the head coach in Jeff Noble's FASD Caregiver Success Coaching Program. And we have group coaching calls there that are like so much fun, but we have to all the time sit and remind people of that all the time. People have been doing this for years, because it's neurotypical to kind of start thinking that way, right? And
Yeah.
yeah, it's hard. I would say another big one too, though, is and this goes to what we're talking about right now, Sandra, is the adjusting our expectations, right?
Yes. Yeah.
It's not lower, and this is something too that I've had this argument, or not, I don't know if argument's the right word, but I've had this discussion with multiple parents and caregivers where they feel like they're lowering expectations. And I'm like, you're not lowering expectations, you're adjusting them based on the person who you are caring for.
Yeah.
Right. And so, so we have to, you know, we have to be able to recognize that. And, you know, this is what is so hard about this disability, is it is such a hidden disability because of our kids' strong expressive language skills. That it really just snows us, it snows the professionals, the other, people out there in the world. And so, and that the other thing too, I talk about is we just have to embrace the judgment too. I say this all the time to the families I work with. If you are not getting ridiculous advice from your friends and family and professionals who don't understand FASD, if you're not getting ridiculous advice from them that makes you just like roll your head, you're probably not parenting these kids the way you should, right?
Yeah.
You kind of have to almost embrace that judgment and those things. And this is why, I always say support groups and being connected with other caregivers for parenting similar kiddos is crucial and vital,
Yeah.
because to be able to sit in a group and be like, oh, here's the advice that, this doctor just gave me, or that my sister told me, or whoever it is. And then we can all kind of laugh about it with you, but also help you maybe problem solve what to say to this person or that person.
Yeah, such good stuff. Good stuff.
Mhm.
So now your kids are all older now. They're in their 20s, most of them or all of them. So
Mhm.
what, how are they doing now? Where are they at? Because we don't outgrow FASD, right? This is a lifelong disability. So how are they doing now? What are the accommodations?
They're doing good. So the oldest two, Akila and Mowgli, who again are dating each other, they live in group homes in Minnesota. Akila actually is doing really, really well right now, and it's because she has extremely high level of supports. Like she lives in her own group home as the only resident. She was in two other group homes before that with three housemates, and it did not work, and it was very problematic, and the police were involved regularly. It was not good. So right now she is the only resident in her group home with two staff 24/7. And that's
Wow.
obviously a very expensive support, but she is thriving because it is the level of support that she currently needs. And it was quite the journey to get to that place. But that's where we are. And Mowgli's doing really well too. And so, and then, my other kids are, my youngest is starting his 4th year of college in Minnesota to be a law enforcement officer. He's doing great. He's also kind of an FASD advocate, he's sitting in all of his classes. Always talking FASD, getting me to come in and speak. So
Awesome.
so that's really cool to see too. And my two that are in the middle are doing pretty well. My 22-year-old, I'm trying to keep track of their ages. He's living with us right now as he kind of digs out of some debt, but kind of bouncing around from job to job. We know this is a hard thing that some of our young adults struggle with, is employment and keeping employment. They don't have a it's just like friends. They don't have a hard time finding friends. They have a hard time keeping friends. And it's the same with employment. They can usually get jobs. They just can't keep jobs. One of my the families I work closely with, their young adult son just got a job at a UPS store and was let go after 4 days because every time a customer walked in the front door, he would moan really loudly.
That sounds like one of mine.
I know, isn't it classic? It's just classic. I'm like, nuts.
Yeah.
But he needs supported employment. That's what I was trying to tell this parent. I'm like, he's got to have a job coach.
Yep.
He's so that's what the thing, and that's one of the things I love. You mentioned that you had listened to Jeff Noble's podcast, the FASD Success Show. My favorite episodes on his and all the various podcasts that are out there, yours and Patricia's and Rob, everybody's. I love it when they're talking to the adults on the spectrum, right?
Yeah.
We've got to listen to the lived experts. And so often, the things that I will hear about them is many of them will talk about how in their 30s things started going differently for them and they started doing better. And, and so that's, this is one of the things, there's always hope with our kids, right?
Yeah.
And I always talk about that, our big challenges in those young adult years, those 20s, is to try to keep them safe and out of too much trouble.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Because our oldest adopted, our kinship girl, she is now in her 30s and she's married and lives in Wyoming and has a baby. Her husband have a 2-year-old now. So things have leveled off, but it never quite goes away because speaking of the confabulation, We deal with like, we FaceTime every few days because they have a 2-year-old grandson. And, but my daughter will still say, oh, remember that time that Graham came and we did, like, she'll tell this family story, like a happy, like family story. And I'll be thinking to myself, that is not exactly how that went down, right? Like she just doesn't, like, her brain has filled in some details that aren't exactly what happened, but yet
Right.
it's in that situation, it's harmless because it's a fun family memory. She'll
Right.
reshare a family story, but it can be scary when we think of our kids if they were to be questioned by the police or
Yes.
an employer or something where the
Mhm.
stakes are a little bit higher.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
although she's come a long way and she's doing well and she's maintaining a job
Mhm.
very well,
Yeah.
doing wonderfully with their son,
Um,
there's still like, you can still like, yeah, this is still a
Yeah,
thing.
there's still some stuff going on, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and confabulation is a tricky one, right? Like
Yeah.
for us, when we finally started to understand it better, which was honestly probably just 5 years ago. I mean, in the last 5 to 7 years is when we
Mhm.
really started to understand confabulation, really not until the end of her high school career. And, for the first couple of years, what we would do is we would just stop challenging her in the moment
Mhm.
when she was doing a
Yeah.
confabulation. And then a few days later, when her brain was in a good, clear space, I would say, hey, when you said this to me on Tuesday or whatever, and then she'll be like, oh, that's not what I meant, or you
Mhm.
misunderstood, or things like that. And
Yeah.
I'd be like, oh, good, I'm really glad, or whatever it is. But then, a couple of years of doing that, and that worked fairly okay. But instead, then we started to teach her the word confabulation. And we said,
Mhm.
so with her, we refer to her FASD as a brain injury. But so we'll say, because of your brain injury, sometimes your brain does this thing called confabulation. All of our brains do this, but your brain does it more often in kind of bigger ways often.
Mhm.
And so, and it's almost like your brain is trying to confuse you or trick you, or to make you think things are true that aren't. And so you have to let us, as your parents and the staff at the group home and the staff at school, we're going to let you know when your brain is doing that. Because otherwise people think you're lying and they don't like to be around you. That's how we
Mhm.
started to approach it. And I trained her staff at the group home, the staff when she was in school still, on that. And when we would bring it up, I made sure everybody did it in a non-shaming way, right?
Mhm.
Because we
Yeah.
could get all shaming about it. And that's another lesson that I've learned is I really regret all the shame-based things that we would say to our kids all the time.
Mhm.
Anyways, so what's cool is now when we call her out on a confabulation like that, she doesn't even get mad. She'll just be like, and then move on. And now what's cool though is there's been a couple of different times in the last year or two where she has stopped herself in a confabulation and said, wait, Mom, is my brain doing that big word? Because she can't remember the word usually. And I'm like, oh my gosh, it is confabulating, you rock star. And we made, like, the first time she did that, we actually went out to dinner and celebrated. It made a huge deal. And that's why I'm a huge advocate for teaching our kids about their brain and about what their
Yes.
brains are good at and what their brains need extra help in and all of that kind of stuff, so that then they can be better self-advocates.
Yeah, because they can also come down hard on themselves.
Yes.
One of my kiddos, if they forget something, will say, "Oh, I'm so stupid," and I'm like, "Oh no, no, no,
No.
we all forget stuff, all of us." And I'll
Exactly.
make sure I point out if I forget something, I'll make sure I make I
Yes.
forgot this, like I forgot to
Yes.
do that. So to
Right.
normalize it, because we all do forget stuff.
Oh, yeah,
Uh,
we do.
yeah.
Yeah. And we all confabulate too. I always say this, right? If you think about, if anybody out there has a significant other, have you ever had one of those arguments where you're like, well, I told you this, and they say, no, you didn't. You say, yes,
Mhm.
I did. No, you didn't. You go back and forth on that. That's almost always confabulation, right?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
just that one of your brains is remembering it wrong. And,
Right.
I always joke and say it's always my husband's in my marriage, but it's actually honestly mine that does it more. And it's one of those things where it's usually the person that said that they told the other person something, because what happens is we practice the conversation in our brain,
Mhm.
and then our brain remembers that we had it, but we never actually did it out
Right.
loud.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's how most neurotypical
Yeah.
brains
Yeah.
confabulate. So that's what we have to normalize it with our kids and say all of our brains do this, but unfortunately, because of some of the way that your brain was injured, your brain's going to do it more often and sometimes in really bigger ways. And, so it's just, and again, the shame-based things too, that's another big lesson. There's so many things we say to our kids all the time, like act your age. 10-year-olds don't do that. You're acting like a toddler. You're acting like a baby. Grow up. Do you think I was born yesterday? Or even just, and this took my husband a long time. He still has this tendency to do this, and then we'll get into a little, not an argument, but we'll have a discussion. Because when our kids have done something that probably wasn't a great choice or whatever, and we're trying to talk about it, he'll say, "What were you thinking?" Even just saying that
What were
drives
you
me
thinking?
nuts. Puts you on the defensive immediately and makes you feel dumb and makes your brain go on fire and your anxiety increase. And then you're way more likely to confabulate or just feel ashamed and not want to talk about it and say, I don't know. I don't want to talk about it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I remember way back when, I'm sure you're familiar with Dr. Karen Purvis, the Connected Child. And I remember when she was still alive being in a workshop of hers. And I remember her saying, and this was before I really had all the FASD education, but I remember her saying, if you find yourself saying, what were you thinking to one of your kids all the time, you have a kid who's experienced trauma.
Yeah.
And I was like, that poor girl that came in as our kinship placement at first, that's all I ever said to that kid. Like, what were you thinking? Why would you do that? Why would you think that was a good idea?
Oh, yeah. We used to do that all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. Those are the things to not say.
Please try not to. And that's what, that's what my bio said, like one of my biggest, I feel like my biggest personal and professional passion and goal I have is to help parents and caregivers not make the same mistakes that we made.
Yeah. Oh, totally. I hear you on that because we made them all, not knowing, you don't know what you don't know. But once we do know, we can do better and then we can help others. Yeah. Yeah. Love that. So let us know, how can we learn more about Families Rising and the training that you offer through them?
Yeah, so Families Rising, our website is wearefamiliesrising.org. And so, we work all over the United States and Canada, doing, I provide training virtually and in person. We have other trainers, contracted trainers. We train on anything within the child welfare realm, right? We train on, of course, my favorite is fetal alcohol because of my passion, but I have a training called the Big Three, raging, lying, and stealing. That's also very popular, but we also train on like grief and loss and adoption competency stuff, self-care, transracial adoption, and, all of that kind of stuff. So, but we also do, advocacy and, lots of other work within kind of the adoption, foster care, kinship care kind of world. So we're on all of the socials too, we're on the TikTok, Instagram, Facebook. We Are Families Rising, I think usually is what will help you find us. And we have a virtual conference. I mean, I don't know when this will go out, but it's next week, July 17th and 18th. We have 2 full days of a really phenomenal virtual conference. People can still register, even if it's after the date. Everything is recorded and people have 90 days until September 30th to view the recordings. And we have Robin Goebel. I don't know if you're familiar with Robin. She wrote a phenomenal book called Raising Kids with Big Baffling Behaviors. She's one of the keynoters, Angela Tucker, who is an adult transracial adoptee who wrote a really good book called You Should Be Grateful, that I highly recommend, is keynoting. And I'm doing a workshop with a friend of mine on launching adults who have experienced trauma. So it's a really great conference. So check that out. We do it every other year virtually. It'll be the following year in 2025 in Orlando. If anybody wants planning a vacation October of 2025 to Orlando.
Nice. So this episode should air next week, actually on the 15th. So anybody listening in like, right away, can access it, or even go to the web, go to We Are Families Rising, and they'll be able to even access the recordings through to September. So we'll make sure that that's all in our show notes so folks can find that out. And then talk to us a little bit more about your work with Jeff Noble and the FASD Caregiver Kickstart.
Yeah. And, so I've been working in that program for a little over 3 years now, and I've known about it. I've been friends with Jeff for many years. We used to have our blogs connected and stuff back many years ago. And I had gone through some of, he has, usually has a week or two of free workshops when he launches the new session each year. And I had gone through it. And then when I saw the price tag, I kind of just clicked off of it. And I never really completely understood what it was, to be honest. So now that I work in that program, I am blown away by it. It is by far one of the most phenomenal programs I've seen out there. So it's the way it works. It's called the FASDsuccess.com is the website to go to, and then click on caregiver coaching, and you can put your name and email there. And you will get info then when he starts up the launch week. It's starting in September at some point, September of 2024. But it's a 6-month program. So for 6 months, we'll have, 100 to 200 people from all over the world. There's at least 12 countries represented, maybe even more than that. They just all have to be English speakers. But we have each month in an online portal, there's new education released that you go through at your own kind of speed. And you don't even have to finish it within the 6 months. You have access to it for many, many years. And then we also have these group coaching calls, which I didn't understand them at first, but we'll have between 20 to 40 or 50 people on a Zoom call, and we'll have them raise their hand, their emoji hand, if they have a question in winter event. And we'll sit and we'll go through what, we'll have 2 coaches on each call. I'm the head coach. We go through each person, give them ideas, and a lot of it's very connected, relational, brain-based kind of supports. And we really have fostered this sense of community. There's a special Facebook group for the people that are in it. And then each month he brings in 1 or 2 experts on other topics. Like he brings in Dr. Mansfield Mella, who is a psychiatrist in Canada who helped to create the FASD medication algorithm. He brings in Dr. Anna Deer Hanlon, who talks about FASD and sleep. He brings in Dr. Vanessa Spiller to talk about emotional regulation. It's just a phenomenal program. And I literally, I've been working with families for over 10 years trying to, help them in this parenting journey of how to parent differently. And for some of us, we can be real slow learners, right? And it can take kind of years to completely shift our paradigm and how we respond to kids. But what I've seen in that program is I have seen within 3 to 6 months this complete shift. And I've seen, like, literally, we have families on there saying that their blood pressure has improved. Like, it's just reduced stress levels. We've had, 2 spouses sitting on there talking about how they're getting along better because now they're both on the same page.
Wow.
Because that's a common thing that I know that you hear too, is we often, when we have 2-parent households, we'll have maybe one parent who's, figured things out and is doing it differently, and the other parent hasn't gotten there yet.
Yeah.
And it's usually the primary caregiver, if there is one, who's, the one. And so that's a common thing. So we work through a lot of that kind of stuff. So it's a great program.
Yeah, and we'll make sure that we put links in our show notes there too. That is great.
Great.
I know I remember listening to Jeff's podcast. I think when I first started listening as well, he was interviewing a woman with an FASD, and when he said the town that she lives in, I think he pronounced it Voorheesville, New York, and I'm like, wait, what? That's like down the road from me. Did he really just say that? So he was interviewing Rebecca Toulouse, who you may know, and
I know Rebecca.
yeah, so she's like my neighbor. So I looked her up and we met for coffee, and we've done actually some trainings together, locally. And I've had her on the podcast several times and whatnot.
Yes.
And for me, it was such an encouragement to meet an adult who's successfully navigating FASD, and kind of gives you hope for your own kiddos. So
absolutely.
I love that. So we could talk forever, I'm sure, all day long, but let's land the plane with just any last thoughts of encouragement. Most of our listeners are adoptive and foster parents, kinship caregivers. So as we wrap up, Barb, any words of encouragement we can end with to give them today?
I would just say, first of all, if you're sitting there and you've got the kids who have those big behaviors, there is hope. My daughter, who is, I've been told by the state of Minnesota, the Department of Human Services, and the Hennepin County Sheriff Department, that she's one of the most aggressive they've ever worked with. She has not been physically aggressive for 2.5 years. And that was after the last day that she was physically aggressive was the day before they allowed me to train the staff at her group home on how to support her properly. But again, and even before that though, so I don't want to make that sound like I'm blaming caregivers. If you have a kid who's raging, it might not, and you're doing the stuff right, they're just not at that place yet. So sometimes and I'll say this too, we did actually used to cause our daughter to rage. We didn't know that. But we were the reason why she raged often. And it was usually because we were trying to use traditional parenting strategies and saying inappropriate things that we thought were appropriate. And once we realized that we were causing her to rage more often, we were causing her to go to the top of the red zone, and we were causing her to stay there longer by things we were saying and doing that we shouldn't have been saying and doing. Her raging did decrease big time, but it didn't go away completely. And so for our, if you have the kids that have some of these really hard behaviors, I just want you to hold on. There is hope. There is hope. Most of them eventually, another family I worked with, their kid was a huge rager. He outgrew it by 7th or 8th grade. So they usually do outgrow those big behaviors, but it's just on the different time. But the more that we can use our connected relational parenting and keep kind of the stress level down in our house, that allows their anxiety. What we want to be mindful of is keeping their anxiety low, because that is when they are more likely to start to learn some of these strategies that we're trying to teach them.
All good advice. So Barb, thank you so much for being with us today and for all that you are doing on behalf of the FASD community, the adoption and foster care community. You're such an asset to the community. So thank you so much for all you're doing and for being with us today.
Yeah, thanks for your work and for having me on.
Thanks so much. Wow, what a great conversation with Barb Clark. I learned some stuff and was so encouraged by the conversation. So I hope that you learned too. And I hope that you'll share what you're learning with your fellow foster and adoptive caregivers. Make sure you check out the show notes so you can get links to the websites and the conferences and things that she's involved with. And make sure that you check out our resources here. We are here to encourage you and equip you for caring for your kiddos. Again, I'm a mom of 5 adopted kids that are all adults now, and our youngest 2 diagnosed with fetal alcohol syndrome. And I'm also a facilitator of the Facets neurobehavioral model, that brain-based approach to parenting our kids, because the traditional parenting methods do not work with our kids. So we need next level skills, and we're here to offer them to you. And I'm passionate about equipping you for your journey, because I know how hard it can be. And like Barb shared, we've all been there, done that the wrong way. And now we're learning better approaches to help better support our kids. So I hope you'll check out all of that, including our coaching, and our workshops that we have, and our support group, Hope for the FASD Journey. It is the only faith-based support group for parents and caregivers raising kids who were prenatally exposed to alcohol, whether they're diagnosed formally or not. So make sure that you check that out, and all of our other resources on our website, justicefororphansny.org. Be sure to find and follow Justice for Orphans on social media at Justice for Orphans. And I'm there too, Sandra Flach, and my blog, my website at sandraflach.com. Check it all out. And again, thank you. I'm so grateful that you spent your valuable time with us today. I'm grateful to have you along for the journey.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Adoption and Foster Care Journey podcast, brought to you by Justice for Orphans. We hope you were encouraged today. Please be sure to subscribe to this podcast and leave a review, and share it with your fellow foster and adoptive parent friends so they can be encouraged too. Be sure to find and follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Justice for Orphans, and check out our website for vital resources at justicefororphansny.org.